you want the real story of Michael Afton, the boy who started as a bully and somehow became the only person trying to undo the horrors his father unleashed, and you're in the right place, because his timeline is one of the most misunderstood in all of Five Nights at Freddy's. Most people know him as the kid in the Foxy mask, but they don't know about the guilt that shaped him, the things he survived that should have killed him, or how he became the one man trying to put an entire haunted legacy to rest. So get comfortable, whether you're listening to relax, sleep, or study. This is a calm, slow walkthrough of Michael's full journey. And if you enjoy deep lore like this, feel free to subscribe. Part 1. The Afton Household Before the Collapse. The genesis of the Five Nights at Freddy's narrative, the source of all subsequent spiritual and corporate horror, is not found within the brightly lit, chaotic arcades of the animatronic restaurants, but rather within the profoundly broken walls of a single, seemingly ordinary suburban home, the Afton household. Before the devastating consequences of the bite of 83 shattered the family forever, the domestic environment was already characterized by an overwhelming, silent dysfunction, setting the stage for the tragedy that would consume the entire entertainment enterprise. This initial atmosphere of emotional neglect and fear is the crucial, foundational layer of Michael Afton's story. The central source of this instability was the family patriarch, William Afton. While outwardly a brilliant engineer and the co-founder of the rapidly expanding Fazbear Entertainment brand, his identity as a father was marked by profound emotional detachment and an all-consuming professional obsession. William's true passion lay in the intricate mechanics of robotics, the lethal complexities of the springlock suits, and later, the darker, esoteric realms of spiritual remnant and the manipulation of life and death. His genius was directly proportionate to his negligence. His focus on his sinister work left a massive, unfillable void where paternal love, guidance, and security should have been. This distance was not merely passive. It allowed his dangerous and unethical professional activities to infiltrate the domestic sphere, turning the family home into a site of surveillance and hidden experimentation, visible only to his terrified children. The structure of the family was further weakened by the significant absence of the Afton mother. Her fate, whether she was lost to death, divorce, or withdrawal due to the escalating horror of William's activities, remains ambiguous in the early lore. Yet her lack of presence created a severe emotional vacuum. This failure to provide a stable counterbalance to William's chilling detachment forced the three Afton children, Michael Afton, the eldest, Elizabeth Afton, the daughter, and the crying child, the youngest, to navigate the rising tide of fear and tension entirely on their own. The lack of adult supervision or moral guidance fostered a destructive environment where Michael's aggression flourished and the crying child's fear metastasized into debilitating terror. This parental negligence created a toxic sibling dynamic. Michael Afton, the eldest, internalized the home's trauma and processed his own resulting resentment and lack of control by directing it outward, manifesting as relentless psychological bullying toward his younger brother. The crying child, highly sensitive and already conditioned to fear the animatronics due to his proximity to his father's work, became the passive, isolated victim. His reliance on the Fredbear plush, later theorized to be a tool for William's remote surveillance, tragically underscores the pervasive lack of genuine comfort available to him. The home environment, as depicted in the Five Nights at Freddy's 4 minigames, was physically defined by this trauma. The locked, private room where William worked, symbolizing the secrets that destroyed the family. the crying child's bedroom, a stage for Michael's jump scares and confinement, and the hallways, avenues of perpetual, inescapable dread. Every architectural feature served as a chilling reminder of a life lived under surveillance, neglect, and psychological torment, confirming that the initial collapse of the Afton legacy was purely domestic and entirely emotional. The emotional groundwork was meticulously laid, ensuring that when the mechanical accident finally occurred, it was merely the final physical expression of a spiritual and familial death that had long been underway. The sheer depth of this pre-existing dysfunction explains why the death of one child could trigger a multi-decade saga of ghosts, vengeance, and corporate ruin, as the spiritual contamination began not in a pizzeria, but in a home where love and safety were fundamentally denied. The profound emptiness left by the parents demanded that the children either become agents of the horror or dedicate their lives to its undoing, which is exactly the path Michael Afton would eventually take in his grueling quest for atonement. Part 2. Michael's childhood role and early resentment. Michael Afton's initial role in the sprawling narrative of Five Nights at Freddy's is defined not by heroism or wisdom, but by cruelty and resentment. He stands as the central antagonist of the early lore, the primary source of the crying child's torment, and the direct human cause of the bite of 83. Understanding Michael's psychological motivations during this period is essential, as his actions were not random acts of sibling rivalry, but rather a profound reflection of his own unresolved trauma stemming from the Afton household's dysfunction. His deep-seated resentment, primarily directed at his negligent father, William Afton, found an accessible, defenseless outlet in his younger brother. As the eldest son, Michael was mature enough to perceive the glaring absence of emotional connection and the unsettling, clandestine nature of William's work. Yet he was too young to possess the coping mechanisms to process such complex parental failure. This helplessness translated into an acute need for control. Unable to exert influence over his distant father or the dangerous environment William created, Michael aggressively asserted dominance over the only person weaker than him, the crying child. This bullying became his warped, destructive attempt to manage the overwhelming chaos and fear in his own life, turning the act of torment into a perverse form of self-soothing. His actions, the relentless scares, the humiliation, the use of masks, were designed to elicit the ultimate reaction, confirming his power and momentarily distracting him from his own profound feeling of powerlessness within the family structure. The resentment Michael felt toward William Afton likely fueled the intensity of his cruelty. Michael's constant, visible violence against his brother can be interpreted as a desperate negative appeal for his father's attention. In a household where indifference was the norm, any strong reaction, even disciplinary action, would be preferable to being utterly ignored. By creating loud, undeniable chaos, Michael was essentially forcing William to acknowledge the family's existence. Furthermore, Michael engaged in a chilling form of trauma displacement. He was afraid of his father and the dangerous, volatile animatronics William designed. By wearing the masks and acting out the aggression of the machines, Michael momentarily traded his role as the victim of his father's neglect for the role of the aggressor, allowing him to externalize and control the very fear that haunted him. He used the instruments of his father's profession, the animatronic images, as tools for his own personal cruelty, enacting a dark psychological parody of William's control over the springlock technology. This persistent psychological warfare was the crucial preparation for the final tragedy. Michael systematically exploited the crying child's deepest, most rational fear, the animatronics. By the time the birthday party arrived, the crying child was in a state of chronic, heightened anxiety, a fragile mental state entirely engineered by Michael's daily torment. His extreme terror, tears, and involuntary movements during the final prank were the direct, measurable result of Michael's calculated abuse. Michael's childhood role, therefore, was not accidental. It was the crucial human fuse that ensured the mechanical accident of the spring locks would have a fatal outcome. This early, devastating failure of sibling love defines Michael's entire subsequent life. His later decades spent seeking atonement, facing death, reanimation, and fire are the direct existential penance for the devastating consequences of his youthful resentment and cruelty. Part 3. Michael's Friends and the Mask Gang. Michael Afton's devastating campaign against his younger brother was not a solitary act, but was solidified and amplified by the involvement of his peers, collectively known as the Mask Gang. This group dynamic was essential, transforming Michael's personal trauma into a shared, escalating act of cruelty and providing the necessary social validation for his toxic behavior. Their participation underscores how external influences can intensify domestic tragedy and directly links the social culture surrounding Fazbear Entertainment to the family's ultimate downfall. The Mask Gang consisted of Michael and 3 friends, each wearing a distinctive mask representing one of the core Freddy Fazbear animatronics: Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Michael's signature Foxy mask. The group structure was critical because it provided Michael with immediate reinforcement. The laughter, high fives, and shared excitement of the pranks acted as positive feedback, encouraging Michael to push the boundaries of his torment further and further. The group consensus dissolved individual responsibility, making the severe psychological abuse seem like harmless, shared fun. This dynamic illustrates the failure of the broader social environment to recognize and intervene in severe bullying, a failure mirrored by the inaction of the adults in the Afton household and the diner itself. The choice of the masks was highly specific and profoundly symbolic. The characters they embodied, Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy, were the physical representations of the crying child's deepest fear. By wearing them, Michael and his friends literally became the stalking, terrifying monsters that haunted the younger boy's mind, transforming themselves into the agents of the very danger the crying child was trying to avoid. The masks created an insurmountable barrier of terror between the victim and his tormentors, ensuring that every scare was maximized by the association with the volatile animatronics. Michael's choice of the Foxy mask carries the heaviest emotional implication. Before the onset of the intense bullying, Foxy was likely the crying child's favorite plush toy. The remnants of a dismantled Foxy plush are seen in the minigames, suggesting a lost bond and an earlier period of comfort. By adopting the Foxy persona for his relentless torment, Michael corrupted this last vestige of safety, effectively turning the image of love and comfort into the face of betrayal and inescapable dread. This act was designed to inflict maximum psychological pain, severing the crying child's last thread of innocence. The Mask Gang's presence also had a direct mechanical role in the final tragedy. It was the combined physical force of the 4 teenagers that was necessary to restrain the struggling crying child and lift him onto the stage, ultimately forcing his head into the jaws of the Fredbear Springlock suit. They were physically essential to the fatal sequence. When the bite of 83 occurred, the friends scattered in shock and panic, leaving Michael alone to face the catastrophic consequences. However, The legacy of the Mask Gang is sealed by the spectral retribution that defines Michael's adult life. The 4 animatronics whose masks they wore become the haunted, vengeful entities that Michael Afton is forced to confront decades later. A terrifying cosmic justice where the tools of his youthful cruelty become the instruments of his adult penance. Part 4. Michael's cruelty. The closet, masks, and daily torment. The foundation of the tragedy that consumed the Afton family was not a singular accident, but a sustained, deliberate campaign of emotional and psychological abuse carried out by Michael Afton. The crying child's death was the inevitable consequence of this daily torment, a calculated pattern of cruelty that pushed the victim past the point of mental and emotional endurance. Michael's actions, meticulously detailed in the 5 Nights at Freddy's 4 minigames, reveal a deep, methodical sadism fueled by his own internal collapse. The most potent and enduring symbol of this cruelty is the Foxy Closet. Michael routinely subjected his younger brother to the trauma of confinement, ambushing him and then locking him inside the closet. This recurring scenario served multiple, insidious purposes. It took the small, private space of the bedroom, which should have been a sanctuary, and transformed it into a claustrophobic site of punishment and panic. The act of enclosure, often leaving the crying child alone with his fear, taught him that isolation was not protection, but rather another form of danger. This psychological conditioning was vital, as it mirrored the final, horrifying sensation of being trapped and enclosed within the jaws of the Fredbear animatronic. The animatronic masks were Michael's primary instruments of terror. Aware of his brother's debilitating fear of the large, mobile performers, a fear justified by their proximity to William Afton's dangerous spring-lock technology, Michael and his gang used the masks relentlessly. They would jump out from around corners, hide behind televisions, and ambush the crying child in his room. This continuous assault erased the line between fantasy and reality for the victim. The crying child was forced to believe that the terrifying mechanical creatures were real, stalking him, and intent on causing harm. This daily conditioning transformed the Freddy Fazbear characters from whimsical mascots into figures of profound physical threat. Michael's systematic torment demonstrates a profound escalation of cruelty. He was not content with simple teasing. He required a reaction, tears, panic, and overwhelming distress, to satisfy his own internal need for control. The lack of any intervention from the adults, particularly the negligence of William Afton, gave Michael tacit permission to increase the severity of his pranks unchecked. The bullying became a pattern of behavior that was integrated into the daily life of the Afton household, making the environment perpetually volatile. This chronic psychological siege ensured that the crying child was in a state of maximum mental fragility by the time of his birthday party. He was emotionally exhausted, hypervigilant, and prone to complete sensory and psychological shutdown. His final, fatal panic on the stage, the violent thrashing and the flood of tears, was not an isolated reaction. It was the devastating culmination of weeks of calculated psychological torture. Michael's cruelty successfully created the perfect victim, one whose extreme distress was guaranteed to trigger the fatal mechanical failure. The true horror of the crying child's death lies not just in the mechanical accident, but in the deliberate, prolonged, and intentional human cruelty that preceded it, making Michael Afton responsible for setting the stage for the family's complete spiritual collapse. Part 5. The Bite of 83, Michael's Worst Mistake. The Bite of 83 is the irreversible event that defines the entire Afton family saga, and is, for Michael Afton, the ultimate catastrophic consequence of his youthful cruelty. This incident moved the narrative from psychological dysfunction to physical, mortal horror, establishing the original trauma that would fuel the franchise's supernatural elements. The reconstruction of this event, primarily through the Five Nights at Freddy's 4 minigames, reveals a sequence of events where human negligence and mechanical instability converged with devastating finality. The scene was the crying child's birthday party at the original Fredbear's family diner. The atmosphere was loud, chaotic, and completely overwhelming for the highly sensitive victim. Michael Afton, driven by arrogance and the desire for the ultimate prank, saw the large, prominent figure of the Fredbear Springlock animatronic as the perfect target for humiliation. This was the moment where Michael's emotional abuse was physically externalized and amplified by the dangerous technology of his father. Surrounded by his masked gang, Michael and his friends physically overpowered the sobbing, desperately struggling crying child. They restrained him and then lifted him high above the crowd of oblivious or laughing partygoers. The goal was simple: to shove the boy's head directly into the open mouth of the animatronic, mocking his fear and forcing him to confront the object of his terror. Michael's shout, a mocking demand for the victim to give Fredbear a big kiss, underscores the depth of his malice, even if he did not intend the fatal outcome. The catastrophic mechanical failure was immediate. The key element was the volatile spring-lock technology, designed by William Afton to allow the suits to function both as animatronics and wearable costumes. These mechanisms were critically sensitive to two things: moisture and sudden movement. The crying child, in a state of absolute maximal terror, was producing both. His tears, distress, and violent thrashing inside the confined cavity of the open jaw introduced moisture and movement that triggered the failsafe. The spring locks instantly malfunctioned. The powerful, compressed endoskeleton components violently snapped out of their secure, retracted position. The jaws of the Fredbear animatronic clamped down with immense mechanical force, crushing the crying child's skull. The injury was catastrophic and immediate. The sound and sight of the accident instantly shattered the atmosphere of the party. The masked gang scattered in terror, leaving Michael alone to witness the irreversible horror of his action. The date is cemented by the 1983 year that flashes on the TV screen in the minigames, establishing the correct timeline and distinguishing this incident as the foundational trauma of the series. The bite of 83 was the cruelest of ironies. The crying child's tears and fear, generated by Michael's abuse, directly caused the mechanical failure of the very machine he feared the most. For Michael, it was a moment of immediate, profound guilt, an accidental murder that permanently defined his identity and condemned him to a life of seeking atonement for the death of his brother. Part 6. The Guilt Era. Post-bite collapse. The aftermath of the bite of 83 was not merely a tragic end for the crying child, but a devastating catalyst that initiated the guilt era for Michael Afton and caused the complete, irreversible post-bite collapse of the entire Afton family. The quiet horror of the hospital superseded the violent chaos of the diner, leaving the surviving members adrift in a sea of guilt, madness, and neglect. For Michael Afton, the impact was instant and all-consuming. The realization that his relentless cruelty had resulted in the death of his own brother imposed an immense, unbearable burden of guilt. The Five Nights at Freddy's 4 minigames hint at his reaction. He is seen fleeing the scene and avoiding the hospital, unable to face the consequence of his accidental murder. This guilt was not fleeting. It became the central, defining motivation of his entire existence. Michael's entire life from that moment onward transformed into an agonizing multi-decade quest for penance and redemption. Every action he takes in the future, facing animatronics, enduring the scooper, tracking his father, is an act of atonement for the sin committed with the Fredbear mask. He carries the weight of his brother's final, terrified moments, a burden that makes him the series' most complex and ultimately sympathetic protagonist. William Afton, however, processed the trauma in a profoundly different and ultimately more destructive manner. The death of his son, caused by a flaw in his own mechanical design, was an unbearable professional and personal failure. Instead of succumbing to simple grief, William spiraled into madness and scientific obsession. His guilt was warped into a desire to conquer death itself. He began channeling his energies into darker experiments, exploring the nature of the soul and the mysterious substance known as remnant. The crying child's death served as the final catalyst that pushed William from negligent engineer to full-fledged serial killer. His subsequent murders, including the MCI, Missing Children incident, were attempts to understand, manipulate, and ultimately replicate the spiritual energy of his lost son, thereby ensuring the spiritual contamination of the entire Fazbear brand. The family structure imploded completely. The absence of the mother, the descent of the father into depravity, and the crippling guilt of the eldest son left the younger daughter, Elizabeth Afton, exposed to the escalating danger. This instability would directly lead to her own demise, reinforcing the idea that the Afton family was cursed by its own patriarchal creations. The guilt era is the pivotal shift in the franchise's timeline. It marks the end of the human tragedy and the beginning of the supernatural horror. Michael's guilt and William's madness become the opposing forces that define the next 40 years of the law. Michael is driven to set things right. William is driven to bury the truth and manipulate the spiritual consequence. The trapped spirit of the crying child, likely bound to the golden Freddy suit, provides the supernatural energy that ensures the horror will continue until Michael sacrifices himself to find closure for the entire doomed family. Part 7. Elizabeth Afton's death. A second trauma. The devastation wrought by the bite of 83 was only the first chapter in the Afton family's tragedy. The death of Elizabeth Afton, Michael's younger sister, represents a second, profound trauma that cemented the family's curse and fundamentally reshaped Michael's understanding of his father's evil. Elizabeth's demise occurred years after her brother's fatal accident, taking place at the dedicated Afton Robotics facility, a secret location designed to house William Afton's most advanced and dangerous animatronic creations, including Circus Baby. This tragedy was not an accident of negligence like the first, but a direct consequence of William's calculated, perverse engineering and his failure to protect his own daughter from the machines he built, specifically to capture and kill. Elizabeth, unlike her older brother, was portrayed as a willful, inquisitive child who possessed a dangerous curiosity about her father's work, particularly the brightly colored, alluring animatronic Circus Baby. William Afton, having already witnessed the fatal consequences of his designs in 1983, was acutely aware of Baby's lethal capabilities. He designed her with internal storage tanks and a specialized claw mechanism explicitly for the purpose of capturing children, a chilling indication of his descent into madness following the crying child's death. William repeatedly and strictly warned Elizabeth to stay away from the animatronic, but his very warnings fueled her childish fascination. She saw the prohibition as a challenge, a barrier placed by a father who was already emotionally distant. The tragic irony is that the machine designed by her father to contain a lethal secret became the very instrument of her death. The moment of Elizabeth's death, later recounted through her own voice lines as Circus Baby, is one of the most chilling sequences in the lore. Ignoring the single child capacity rule and driven by her desire to get close to the machine she loved, Elizabeth approached Baby alone. The animatronic, operating on its intended programming, which was to lure and capture, used its internal claw mechanism to swiftly pull Elizabeth inside. This act was immediate, violent, and concealed, leaving no witnesses and confirming that William Afton had created a monster he could not control, despite his genius. The loss of his daughter, not through a mechanical accident, but through the intended function of a machine designed for abduction, deepened William's guilt and further solidified his psychotic spiral. He had lost one child to negligence and another to design, confirming the cursed nature of the Afton name. For Michael Afton, his sister's death represented a horrifying reaffirmation of the danger inherent in his father's world. If the bite of 83 taught Michael the consequences of his own cruelty, Elizabeth's death taught him the inherent, foundational evil of his father's work. This second trauma became a defining factor in his adult life. It transformed his search from one of mere atonement for his brother to a complex mission of familial rescue and spiritual closure. He now carried the guilt of two siblings, one he killed through negligence, and one he failed to save from his father's depravity. Elizabeth's tragic end, which bound her soul to the central antagonist animatronic Baby, set up the essential conflict of sister location. It gave Michael a direct, urgent reason to descend into the Afton robotics facility, driven by the desperate hope of fulfilling the desperate plea of his younger sister. This second family trauma provided Michael with his true, redemptive mission, finding Elizabeth, and in doing so, confronting the full scope of his father's monstrosity. Part 8. William Afton's disappearance. Following the catastrophic deaths of both the crying child and Elizabeth Afton, and the subsequent unraveling of the Fazbear corporate structure due to the MCI, Missing Children incident, William Afton's behavior became increasingly erratic, culminating in his dramatic disappearance after the closure of the 1993 restaurant location. This vanishing act left Michael Afton behind, burdened by immense guilt and profound confusion, forcing him into a relentless pursuit of the truth that would define his life's mission. William's physical disappearance was not a retreat. It was a desperate, final act of violence that transformed him from a serial killer into the enduring, undead monster known as Springtrap. The period between the MCI, 1985 to 1987, depending on the law interpretation, and the final closure of the FNaF 1 location in 1993 was one of deepening paranoia for William. His guilt over his children's deaths and the fear of being exposed for the MCI drove him to dismantle his own creations. In the minigames of FNaF 3, we see William returning to the abandoned, deteriorating 1993 pizzeria, seeking to destroy the original 4 animatronics, Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy, in a frantic attempt to cover up his crimes and eliminate the last vestiges of evidence. He successfully destroys the physical casings of the animatronics, which tragically frees the angry, trapped souls of the children he murdered. In a pivotal moment of sheer terror, the freed, vengeful spirits corner William in a secluded, forgotten area of the pizzeria, the safe room. This room was an architectural anomaly, an unmapped space that animatronics were programmed to ignore, making it inaccessible to the children's possessed bodies. Desperate and trapped, William's only means of defense was to seek refuge inside the very technology he created to kill. The discarded, decayed Spring Bonnie animatronic suit. He donned the lethal costume in a moment of panicked desperation, believing the empty suit would provide shelter from the vengeful ghosts. The environment, however, betrayed him. Moisture, possibly from leaking pipes or even his own frantic breathing and sweat, caused the delicate spring lock mechanisms within the suit to fail. The locks snapped shut instantly and violently, impaling and crushing William Afton within the suit. This horrifying transformation was his righteous, agonizing punishment. William did not merely die. He was fused into the suit, trapped in a grotesque limbo state powered by the spiritual remnant of his own victims. His disappearance was therefore a physical transformation into the undead entity, Springtrap, destined to suffer eternal agony and spiritual torment. Michael Afton was left with only silence and his crushing guilt. He had no definitive knowledge of his father's true fate. William's disappearance left a crucial, gaping void, compelling Michael to step into the role of the investigator. Michael had to reconcile his past trauma, his own guilt over the crying child, with the growing, terrifying realization that his father was not just negligent, but a monstrous, serial killer. This confusion and the need for closure provided the final, necessary emotional push for Michael to accept his later dangerous mission. He needed to find his father, not necessarily for reconciliation, but to end the cycle of violence and understand the full, terrifying truth of the Afton legacy that now rested squarely on his shoulders. Part 9. Michael's redemption begins. Find Elizabeth. The true inception of Michael Afton's redemption arc is marked by a single, desperate instruction he received from his father, William Afton. Find Elizabeth. This command, delivered after William's disappearance and Michael's years spent stewing in guilt over the bite of 83, provided the elder Afton's son with the clear, purposeful direction he had been desperately lacking. Michael seized this mission, recognizing it not as an act of familial obedience, but as his first tangible step toward atoning for the disasters his family had wrought. The mission centered on the underground Afton Robotics facility, the secret location where William conducted his most perverse experiments and where Michael's sister, Elizabeth, had been consumed by Circus Baby. William, knowing the lethal dangers of his own creations, but possibly compelled by a desperate, fleeting shred of parental anxiety or simply a need to monitor his experiments, sent Michael into the abyss. He instructed Michael to go to the subterranean facility, navigate its horrors, and recover or locate his sister. For Michael, who was already crippled by the guilt of having accidentally caused the death of his younger brother, this was a lifeline. He viewed the mission as an opportunity for genuine, meaningful penance. He could not bring the crying child back, but he could potentially save Elizabeth's soul or bring closure to her tragedy. The mission to find Elizabeth thus transformed from a simple directive into a spiritual mandate. Michael accepted the immense danger involved, knowing that facing his father's creations was the only way to alleviate the overwhelming burden of his past failures. His acceptance of this mission demonstrated a key shift in his character. The cruel, negligent bully of 1983 was replaced by a man driven by a profound, if morbid, sense of duty. Michael was no longer running from his guilt. He was actively charging toward the source of his family's pain. He was willing to endure the horrors of the underground facility, the cold, lethal intelligence of the Funtime animatronics, and the lingering darkness of his father's laboratory, all in the name of his sister. This act was one of self-sacrifice, an acknowledgement that he needed to immerse himself in the consequences of the Afton legacy to achieve spiritual cleansing. The journey to find Elizabeth became Michael's personal descent into hell. It forced him to confront the full, terrifying reality of his father's descent into madness, a reality far worse than the simple negligence that led to the first bite. He learned that his father was not just a distant man, but a monster who actively built machines to capture and kill. This revelation hardened Michael, preparing him for the arduous, multi-decade struggle that lay ahead. The redemption arc began not with success, but with a willingness to face death itself, confirming that Michael's primary drive was no longer self-preservation, but the restoration of his shattered family's honor and the eventual undoing of his father's endless cycle of violence. Part 10. Sister Location. Michael's Descent Underground. Michael Afton's acceptance of his father's command to find Elizabeth culminated in his deep, perilous journey into the Sister Location underground facility, the headquarters of Afton Robotics, LLC. This facility, concealed beneath the surface, was not a restaurant, but a highly sophisticated, secure laboratory designed by William Afton for the explicit purpose of kidnapping children and experimenting with remnant, the spiritual energy derived from suffering souls. Michael's descent into this horrifying environment marks the physical start of his redemption and transforms him into the franchise's central investigator. Michael assumed the role of a technician or security guard, known in-game as Mike, in order to gain access to the secure facility. His duties required him to navigate the pitch-black, claustrophobic vents and mechanical corridors, performing dangerous, menial tasks on the animatronics. The setting itself was a psychological masterpiece of horror, designed to isolate the employee and expose them to the cold, lethal intelligence of the Funtime animatronics, Circus Baby, Funtime Freddy, Funtime Foxy, and Ballora. These animatronics were far more advanced than their earlier counterparts. They were engineered not just to perform, but to actively lure, track, and capture. The psychological horror of the facility was inescapable. Michael worked under the pervasive influence of Circus Baby, who was possessed by the soul of his sister, Elizabeth Afton. Baby, speaking with the deceptive voice of the animatronic, but guided by the child's trapped spirit, subtly manipulated Michael throughout the week. Her communication was designed to guide him deeper into the facility, eventually revealing the truth about the scooper and the plan devised by the animatronics. This close proximity to his sister's suffering provided Michael with the concrete proof he needed. Elizabeth was indeed trapped, and his mission was tragically real. Michael's work exposed him directly to the terrible purpose of the facility. He was forced to witness the cold, industrial environment where his father conducted his grotesque experiments, a direct confirmation of William's utter moral collapse following the crying child's death. The facility contained the scooping room, the industrial chamber designed to disembowel animatronics for maintenance, and later used for the collection of remnant. This environment hardened Michael. He survived near constant threats, proving his resolve was greater than his fear. He demonstrated a willingness to face the literal terrifying consequence of his family's legacy. The descent underground was not just physical, it was transformative. Michael, the guilt-ridden bully, was forged into a focused, resilient operative. By successfully navigating the facility and confronting the dangers of his father's creations, he fulfilled the first part of his penance. His final climactic act in the facility, allowing himself to be scooped, was the ultimate necessary sacrifice that finalized his commitment to his mission. securing his place as the undead protagonist who would pursue his father across the entire timeline. The sister location facility, therefore, acted as Michael's tomb, his temporary prison, and his necessary birthplace for the long, arduous journey of atonement ahead. Part 11. Scooped and Rebirth. Michael becomes a walking corpse. The climax of the sister location narrative marks the true, agonizing transformation of Michael Afton from a living, guilt-ridden man into the franchise's enduring, undead protagonist. This shocking event, known as the scooping, was the final step in the plan orchestrated by the Funtime animatronics, who had fused into a single entity called Enard. Enard was a complex mechanical amalgam of the endoskeletons and circuits of Circus Baby, Funtime Freddy, Funtime Foxy, and Ballora. Guided primarily by the voice and purpose of Elizabeth Afton's soul trapped inside Baby, Enard had one goal: escape the underground facility. The animatronics knew they could not escape in their large, segmented forms. They needed a disguise, a costume that was biologically convincing. They needed a human body. Michael, having successfully navigated the facility and brought the animatronics together, was lured to the scooping room. This room contained the industrial apparatus known as the scooper, a device originally designed by William Afton to disembowel animatronics quickly for maintenance and later used for the extraction and manipulation of remnant. In a devastating turn of events, Enard activated the device. The scooper violently disemboweled Michael Afton. He suffered a fatal, excruciating injury, effectively dying in the process. Immediately following his death, the collective entity of Enard crawled inside Michael's empty, hollowed-out body. Michael Afton's corpse became the organic, human suit that Enard needed to escape the facility and walk among the living unobserved. The animatronics had successfully hijacked Michael's body for their temporary freedom. However, the technology involved was not purely mechanical. The scooper had been utilized in experiments involving remnant, the highly potent spiritual energy associated with the agony of dying souls. The machine, designed to extract remnant, inadvertently infused Michael's corpse with enough residual spiritual energy to prevent his permanent decay and death. This spiritual technology, the very science William Afton obsessed over, created a shocking, unforeseen side effect. Michael's soul was not released. Michael Afton was reborn as a walking corpse. He was technically undead, sustained by the spiritual science of his father's work. The consequences were gruesome. His flesh began to decay, his skin took on a grotesque purple hue, and he became a repulsive, decaying parody of human life. This rebirth, fueled by the same agony and spiritual energy that defined his brother's death, was the ultimate physical penance for his original sin. Michael had gone through death and returned, forever bearing the physical marks of his commitment to his mission. This dramatic transformation finalized his destiny as the relentless, unkillable protagonist who would pursue his father to the very end of the timeline. Part 12. Enard leaves and Michael continues living. The events immediately following the scooping cemented Michael Afton's bizarre, undead status and officially launched his lifelong quest for atonement. After using Michael's fresh corpse as a walking disguise, the merged animatronic entity Enard escaped the Afton robotics facility and moved briefly through the surface world. The disguise, however, was temporary. Michael's body was a biological vessel, and biological vessels decay. Within a short period, Michael's flesh began to rot due to the lack of functioning internal organs. The body turned an unhealthy, noticeable purple hue, leading the horrified entity Ennard to abandon the decaying husk. Ennard, disgusted by the putrefying corpse, ejected itself through the sewers and eventually fragmented into its component parts, with Elizabeth Afton's spirit as baby, eventually reforming as Scrap Baby. Michael Afton's fate was far stranger. By all laws of nature, he should have died and stayed dead, but the residual remnant, the spiritual substance associated with intense agony, which was infused into his body during the scooping, kept his consciousness alive and his body functioning in a state of suspended decay. This transformation demonstrated the profound, dark power of his father's science and the supernatural energies at play. Michael was now a permanent anomaly, a sentient, rotting corpse dedicated to a spiritual mission. In a poignant, concluding monologue delivered at the end of Sister Location, Michael Afton speaks directly to his father, William Afton. He confirms that he successfully found Elizabeth, fulfilling the initial mission, though not in the way William expected. He describes the horrors he faced, his transformation, and the mechanical entity that used his body. The monologue culminates in Michael declaring his new, singular purpose. He uses the iconic line, "Father, it's me, Michael. I found her. I put her back together. I'm going to come find you." This final declaration is a powerful statement of purpose and forgiveness. By saying he put her back together, Michael acknowledges that he helped Elizabeth's spirit achieve some form of agency through Ennard's escape, fulfilling the spiritual promise made to his younger brother years earlier. "I will put you back together." His new life is now completely dedicated to one goal: ending William Afton's reign of terror. He is no longer seeking redemption for the bite of 83 through silent suffering. He is actively seeking justice and closure. Michael's continued existence as a walking, animated corpse solidified his role as the franchise's ultimate hunter and protagonist. The remnant that saved his life was the very science that his father obsessed over, creating a tragic, poetic destiny. Michael would spend the next several decades hunting William, driven forward by the need to atone for two siblings and end the curse of the Afton name, fully accepting the burden of being the family's self-appointed cleaner. Part 13. Michael searches for his father, following his gruesome transformation and rebirth after the events of Five Nights at Freddy's, Sister Location. Michael Afton embarked on a long, arduous, and clandestine search for his father, William Afton. This pursuit was not a simple missing persons case. It was a decades-long spiritual and physical hunt, driven by the crushing weight of Michael's own guilt and his absolute commitment to ending the Afton family's reign of terror. Michael was now a sentient, decaying corpse, perpetually sustained by the dark science of remnant, making him the perfect, relentless hunter capable of surviving environments that would kill any ordinary man. His search was necessarily indirect and reliant on rumors and whispers within the perpetually cursed orbit of Fazbear Entertainment. Michael could not simply walk into a police station or approach his father openly. He was a walking biological anomaly, visible proof of his father's grotesque experiments. He had to operate on the fringes, taking on dangerous, low-paying jobs at various dilapidated or abandoned locations associated with the Fazbear name. Each job was a potential lead, a horrifying step closer to understanding the full scope of his father's serial murders and spiritual manipulations. Michael was hunting for the truth behind the missing children incident, recognizing that the end of his father's violence was intrinsically linked to the fate of the souls William had trapped. His motivation had evolved far beyond the initial, simple plea to find Elizabeth. Now, Michael's mission was total atonement. He he carried the burden of two siblings, the crying child, whose death he caused, and Elizabeth, whose soul was trapped in a vengeful machine built by his father. His pursuit of William Afton was the only means he had to achieve closure for his family and for the souls of the children William had murdered. He saw himself as the self-appointed cleaner of the Afton legacy, the man cursed to finish the nightmare his father started. Michael's life became defined by the pursuit of the remnants of his father's work. He spent years investigating the decaying buildings, the sealed rooms, and the forgotten corners of the Fazbear Empire. He was looking for evidence, for closure, and most importantly, for his father's final hidden resting place. This quest was lonely and physically grueling, forcing him to subsist as a rotting undead figure, often relying on aliases and false identities to secure his night guard positions. The search itself became a form of penance, a continuous suffering that he willingly endured because he believed he deserved nothing less for the unforgivable sin of the Bite of 83. The ultimate goal of this search was twofold. First, he needed to stop William Afton from causing any further harm, an acknowledgement that his father was an ongoing, active source of evil. Second, he needed to find a way to free the trapped souls of all the victims, including his siblings and the children of the missing children incident. Michael realized that ending his father's physical existence was secondary to ending the spiritual consequence of his crimes. His tireless search through the timeline, a figure of perpetual decay moving through the history of horror, is the central, unifying thread of the entire Five Nights at Freddy's narrative. He was looking for the truth, but more profoundly, he was looking for a way to die and finally find the peace he denied his little brother. Part 14. Five Nights at Freddy's One Era. Mike Schmidt. Identity theory. It is a widely accepted and heavily substantiated theory in the lore of Five Nights at Freddy's that Michael Afton is the protagonist of the original 1993 game, working under the alias Mike Schmidt. This theory provides a crucial connection between Michael's post-scooping life and the original haunted pizzeria, reinforcing his role as the relentless investigator seeking atonement. The evidence is compelling and centers on Michael's personal need to clean up his father's mess. The establishment of the Mike Schmidt identity allowed Michael to infiltrate the 1993 restaurant, which was one of the last remaining locations that housed the animatronics possessed by the children of the missing children incident. Working as the night security guard, a job renowned for being dangerous and low-paying, was the perfect way for Michael to access the inner workings of the location without attracting undue corporate or governmental scrutiny. His undead status, sustained by Remnant, made him uniquely qualified to survive the horrifying encounters with the possessed animatronics. The most crucial piece of evidence supporting this theory comes at the end of the game. After the final night, the security guard, Mike Schmidt, is fired. The termination notice lists several damning reasons for his dismissal, most notably tampering with the animatronics, general unprofessionalism, and odor. The explicit mention of odor is the central linchpin connecting the alias to Michael Afton. Only Michael, the rotting, decaying corpse animated by Remnant, after being scooped in sister location, would possess a noticeable and severe odor that would warrant official termination. This single detail provides the horrific physical proof that the night guard is none other than the guilt-ridden son of William Afton. Michael's motive for working this extremely dangerous job was clear: investigation and atonement. He was not seeking money or employment security. He was seeking answers regarding the state of the animatronics, the location of his father's final disappearance, and the possibility of freeing the trapped souls of the children his father murdered. By actively tampering with the animatronics, the reason for his firing, Michael was likely attempting to interact with the spirits, seeking to guide them toward rest or understand their connection to his father. His presence at this particular location, the site of some of the original haunts, confirms his dedication to tracking the spiritual contamination created by William Afton. The animatronics of the 1993 location, possessed by the angry, vengeful spirits of the MCI victims, recognized Michael. Although they were hunting the security guard, their aggression was also likely aimed at the son of their murderer. This job was not just an investigation. It was a confrontation with the direct consequences of the Afton name. Michael survived the week, enduring the terrifying attacks of Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy, not out of bravery, but out of a grim, self-imposed necessity. The Mike Schmidt identity theory firmly places Michael at the epicenter of the franchise's original horror, linking the early, subtle paranormal events to the complex, tragic family story that drives the entire lore. Part 15, Five Nights at Freddy's 2 and Five Nights at Freddy's 3 Connections. Michael Afton's ceaseless quest for his father, William Afton, provides the essential connective tissue that links the disparate locations and timelines of the entire Five Nights at Freddy's series, specifically bridging the gap between the 1987 Five Nights at Freddy's 2 and the later 2023 Five Nights at Freddy's 3 settings. His journey of atonement required him to follow every lead and confront every contaminated site, making his presence a recurring, though often disguised, feature of the Fazbear history. While the evidence for his presence in the Five Nights at Freddy's 2 location is more circumstantial, several prominent theories place Michael there under the alias Fritz Smith, the night guard who works the very brief seventh night. This guard is immediately fired for the same specific reasons as Mike Schmidt in the original game: tampering with the animatronics and, crucially, odor. The odor reference remains the undeniable fingerprint of Michael Afton, the rotting corpse. If Michael did work at this 1987 location, his motive was likely driven by the need to investigate the MCI site and the early, advanced animatronics, which were still being used before the bite that led to the restaurant's immediate closure. His tampering would have been an attempt to interact with or free the recently trapped spirits. The connection to Five Nights at Freddy's 3 is far more direct and narratively crucial. This game takes place approximately 30 years after the original pizzeria's close, set within the dilapidated, hastily constructed horror attraction known as Fazbear's Fright. By this time, Michael has been relentlessly searching for his father for decades, and the trail finally ends at this new attraction. Michael almost certainly takes the job as the night guard at Fazbear's Fright, specifically because he knows his father, now trapped inside the decaying Spring Bonnie suit and reborn as the monster Springtrap, is located there. The presence of Springtrap, William Afton's spectral, undead form, is the primary focus of the Five Nights at Freddy's 3 gameplay. For Michael, this is the ultimate confrontation. He is not merely surviving a haunted house. He is facing the man responsible for the family's ruin, the architect of his brother's death, the cause of his sister's spiritual imprisonment, and the reason for Michael's own agonizing undead existence. Michael's decision to work at Fazbear's Fright is a voluntary and final step in his mission of redemption. He knew the danger. He knew his father was the main threat, and he willingly walked into the facility to confront him. This act confirms the full transformation of Michael from a guilty victim into the courageous, relentless protagonist who actively seeks to end the nightmare of the Afton legacy, linking the 1983 tragedy directly to the final acts of violence and spiritual closure. Part 16. Fazbear's Fright and Springtrap's Return. The events of Five Nights at Freddy's 3, set in the horror attraction Fazbear's Fright, represent the culmination of Michael Afton's relentless, multi-decade hunt and the agonizing, violent return of Springtrap. For Michael, who has spent years tracking down the lingering spiritual contamination of his father, this location is the final cursed destination. He takes the job as the night guard, knowing precisely what he will find. Fazbear's Fright was constructed years after the original pizzerias closed, designed to exploit the urban legends surrounding the missing children incident. The attraction's owners recovered various artifacts and props from the abandoned locations, including the horrifying, decrepit, and decaying Spring Bonnie suit. Inside this suit, fused into the technology by the failed spring locks, was William Afton, now a murderous, immortal, and spectral entity known as Springtrap. The horror attraction was merely a stage for the final confrontation between the son and the father. When Michael arrives as the night guard, he is not driven by fear, but by grim determination. His goal is to survive the encounter and somehow finalize the spiritual war his family began. He is now face to face with the monster who destroyed his family. A monster preserved by the very remnant science that also sustains Michael's own undead body. The confrontation is a dark poetic irony. Two rotting figures, both physically immortalized by the suffering souls William created, locked in a battle within a crumbling shell of a nightmare factory. The gameplay of Five Nights at Freddy's 3 reflects this personal struggle. Springtrap is the only physical animatronic threat. The other phantoms are likely hallucinations triggered by Michael's own past trauma, heat, and poor air quality. Ghosts of the children his father killed, and the family's past tragedy. Michael survives the week, enduring his father's relentless, murderous pursuits, not because he is lucky, but because he is physically resilient and emotionally resolved. He knows he cannot truly die, which gives him the ultimate advantage over his still vengeful father. The climax of the game is the deliberate destruction of Fazbear's Fright by fire. While the exact agent of the fire is debatable, the most supported theory is that Michael Afton initiated the fire himself. This final act of incineration was his attempt to end the nightmare, to destroy his father and the last physical remnants of the spiritual contamination they both carried. Michael's willingness to set the fire, knowing his father was inside, is the ultimate manifestation of his atonement. He survived the fire, as later evidence suggests, but the act itself provided the necessary spiritual disruption that moved the narrative toward its final closure in Pizzeria Simulator, ensuring that Springtrap, though damaged, was released into the world again for the final confrontation. Part 17. The Realization. Father, it's me, Michael. The final climactic audio monologue delivered by Michael Afton at the end of Five Nights at Freddy's. Sister Location is one of the most powerful and revealing moments in the entire lore. This monologue, spoken immediately after Michael's traumatic rebirth as a decaying corpse, provides the full context for his subsequent actions and serves as a direct declaration of war against his father, William Afton. It is a moment of profound realization, self-acceptance, and definitive commitment to his redemptive mission. The monologue begins with Michael confirming the success of his mission to find Elizabeth. He recounts the horrors of the underground facility, his discovery of the fused animatronic entity Enard, and the brutal process of being scooped, killed, and hollowed out so that Enard could use his body as a temporary disguise. He then describes the immediate aftermath: his rotting corpse, the disgust of the animatronics, and Ennard's eventual abandonment of his decaying body. This narrative establishes that Michael is fully aware of his shocking, undead state. The most poignant and significant line is the direct address: "Father, it's me, Michael." This single sentence is loaded with decades of tragedy and meaning. It is Michael identifying himself not as a nameless employee or an alias like Mike Schmidt, but as William's son, the son who killed his brother, the son who was sent to rescue his sister, and the son who is now a literal monster due to his father's technology. The simple identity reveals the depth of their tragic relationship and the full measure of Michael's suffering. Michael continues by stating, "I put her back together." This is a key line that ties directly back to the spiritual promise made to the crying child in the hospital. "I will put you back together." By helping Elizabeth's spirit and the other animatronics escape in the form of Ennard, Michael symbolically fulfills the desire to restore his family, even in a grotesquely mechanical way. This realization confirms that Michael's life is now dedicated to the spiritual completion of his family's fractured souls. The monologue culminates in the decisive threat that solidifies his role as the franchise's ultimate protagonist: "I'm going to come find you." This is Michael taking ownership of his mission. He is no longer seeking his father out of obedience or confusion, but out of a deep-seated need for justice and closure. This statement establishes the pursuit that leads him through the subsequent games, including his time as Mike Schmidt and his eventual confrontation with Springtrap at Fazbear's Fright. The realization is clear: Michael will endure his immortal suffering for as long as it takes to end his father's evil and secure the final peace for his siblings and the other trapped children. Part 18. The Pizzeria Simulator Setup. Following his escape from the fire at Fazbear's Fright, Michael Afton was once again adrift, his mission to end his father's violence incomplete. William Afton, although severely damaged and known as Scraptrap, had also survived the fire. The final, critical chapter of Michael's life and his ultimate act of atonement take place within the elaborate trap set by his father's former business partner and friend, Henry Emily, in the game known as Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator. This setup was designed to be the definitive final end to the Afton saga. Michael, still bearing the burden of his undead existence and his unrelenting guilt, answered a vague, intentionally misleading advertisement for an owner-manager of an independent pizzeria. He walked willingly into this final scenario, understanding that any job associated with the Fazbear name was a lure, a potential source of the spiritual contamination he was dedicated to cleaning up. By accepting the role, Michael proved his absolute commitment to his mission. He was not afraid of danger. He was compelled by duty. The pizzeria Michael was hired to manage was, in reality, a specially designed lure location, orchestrated by Henry Emily. Henry, who was just as scarred by William Afton's crimes, having lost his own daughter, Charlotte, in the MCI, had spent years devising the perfect final plan. His goal was to construct a location that would draw in all the remaining highly dangerous animatronic entities containing the souls of William's victims, including the fragmented forms of Elizabeth Afton, Scrap Baby, Funtime Freddy, Molten Freddy, and crucially, William Afton, Scraptrap, himself. Michael's role in this final setup was crucial. He served as the bait and the final administrator. He managed the business during the day, creating the illusion of a normal, functioning pizzeria. By night, he was instructed to recover the terrifying, salvaged animatronics one by one, ensuring they were all contained within the building's hidden ventilation system. Michael knew the danger of these salvaged entities, particularly the twisted form of his own sister, Scrap Baby, and his monstrous father. He willingly completed this horrifying task, driven by the knowledge that this gathering was the final necessary step to securing their release. Michael's willingness to walk into this known trap, to work alongside his sister's possessed remains, and to knowingly draw his father toward his final doom, confirms the completion of his arc from bully to selfless savior. He accepted the job as the final agonizing stage of his penance, recognizing that his life was a sacrifice necessary to end the curse. The pizzeria simulator setup was the ultimate containment vessel, designed by Henry and executed by Michael, ensuring that the remaining pieces of the Afton tragedy were finally in place for the purifying fire that would bring an end to the entire haunting. Part 19. Henry's final plan and Michael's role. The events of Five Nights at Freddy's Pizzeria Simulator represent the meticulous execution of Henry Emily's final plan, a complex, agonizingly planned strategy designed to definitively end the cycle of violence, spiritual contamination, and corporate deception that had plagued the Afton and Emily families for decades. Michael Afton's voluntary involvement in this scheme was not merely logistical. It was the ultimate, necessary act of compliance that validated his lifelong quest for atonement, culminating in Henry's powerful and moving declaration of forgiveness. Henry Emily, the co-founder of the original Fazbear brand and a brilliant engineer, had suffered the loss of his daughter, Charlotte, whose soul now possessed the puppet. His plan was an act of both justice and mercy, aimed at luring the remaining spirits, including his daughter, Michael's siblings, and William Afton, into a single, custom-built location that could serve as a gigantic, inescapable spiritual containment vessel. The ultimate goal was incineration, a purifying fire that would destroy the physical remnants of the animatronics, release the trapped souls, and finally bring peace to the victims. Michael Afton's role in this final plan was crucial and multifaceted. He served as the bait and the collector. By answering the misleading job advertisement and taking on the role of the pizzeria manager, Michael provided the necessary human presence to operate the facility and lure the salvaged animatronics. His primary task was the dangerous recovery of the 4 remaining highly hostile entities: Scrap Baby, Elizabeth Afton, Molten Freddy, Funtime Freddy, Ennard, Lefty, containing the puppet Charlotte, and Scrap Trap, William Afton. Michael risked his own already tenuous existence night after night, willingly bringing these lethal spiritual anchors into the building's hidden ventilation system, ensuring that Henry's trap was fully sprung. Michael's continued operation of the business, even as he faced constant threat, demonstrated to Henry the sincerity of his remorse. Henry, in his climactic audio monologue, directly addresses Michael, acknowledging his presence and the burden he carries. He identifies Michael not as the son of his enemy, but as an ally and a victim of William's darkness. This recognition is the profound moment of absolution. Henry states, with solemn certainty, that Michael's attempt to free his sister and his acceptance of this final sacrifice prove that his own heart was good, despite the grievous errors of his youth. Henry acknowledges that Michael was also a casualty of William's legacy, not just a perpetrator. The entire setup required Michael's willing sacrifice. Henry designed the location knowing that the final step, the fire, would result in the deaths of everyone inside, including Michael. Michael, now a man without a living future, and haunted by his past, accepted this fate without hesitation. He had finally found the purpose to his endless, undead existence, to be the one who ensures the nightmare ends, even if it requires his own immolation. Michael's participation validated Henry's hope that the Afton family was not entirely beyond redemption, confirming that the son was willing to undo the terrible damage caused by the father. His decision to stay in the burning building was the final defining act of his arduous quest for spiritual peace, marking the successful execution of Henry's meticulously planned closure. Part 20. The Ending Fire, Michael's Sacrifice. The ending fire of Five Nights at Freddy's Pizzeria Simulator is the definitive narrative climax of the entire original timeline, representing the ultimate act of purification and the fulfillment of Michael Afton's profound, multi-decade mission for atonement. This intentional conflagration was designed by Henry Emily to be the final spiritual solution, a necessary destruction to ensure that the spirits of the victims and the essence of the villain would never contaminate the world again. Michael's choice to remain in the burning facility represents his ultimate and final sacrifice. After Michael successfully contained all 4 key animatronics within the facility, Scrap Baby, Molten Freddy, Lefty, and Scrap Trap, Henry initiated the final phase. He locked down the building, preventing any escape, and delivered his farewell monologue over the PA system. This speech was directed at his daughter, the trapped spirits, William Afton, and most importantly, Michael. Henry explained that the fire was designed to destroy the physical hosts, the animatronic husks, and through that destruction, free the souls trapped within their metallic prisons. This was the moment of release for the victims. Michael Afton was entirely aware of his imminent death. He was not trapped by accident. He chose to stay. Unlike the fearful flight of his youth following the bite of 83, Michael now faced death with calm resolve. He had endured death once before via the scooper, but he understood that this fire, orchestrated by Henry and designed specifically to destroy the remnant that animated him, would be final. His decision to remain inside, listening to Henry's final words of forgiveness and spiritual assurance, was the highest expression of his guilt and his redemption. His sacrifice was multi-layered. First, it was the final act of penance for the crying child's death. By willingly embracing the flames, Michael was enduring the maximum suffering necessary to atone for his accidental murder. Second, his presence ensured the success of Henry's plan. Michael, as the manager, was the final human link that guaranteed the animatronics were contained and the fire could commence without interruption. He was the anchor that sealed the trap. Finally, his choice granted him the peace he had been seeking since he was a teenager. His life had become an agonizing, lonely existence as a rotting corpse, sustained only by the purpose of this mission. The fire offered him the only true rest available. The fire consumed the facility, destroying the animatronics, the location, and theoretically, the mortal remains and spiritual essence of both Michael and William Afton. Michael's sacrifice provided the perfect narrative closure for the Afton tragedy. He entered the fire as the guilt-ridden son and emerged as the self-sacrificing hero. The destruction of the facility was the ultimate cleanup effort, ending the nightmare that began in his childhood home. Michael died, having finally fulfilled his vow to both his siblings and the other victims, successfully laying the family's curse to rest in the cleansing flames. Part 21. Michael's Legacy and What Happens After Death. Michael Afton's legacy is one of profound redemption. a transformation from the thoughtless, cruel bully who initiated the central tragedy into the self-sacrificing protagonist who successfully ended the spiritual war. His final act in the pizzeria simulator fire provided the necessary narrative and emotional closure for the entire original Five Nights at Freddy's arc, establishing him as the primary hero of the saga. The most crucial element of his legacy is the presumed release of his soul. Henry Emily's fire was specifically designed to destroy the remnant, the spiritual energy that trapped souls and animated Michael's corpse. By staying in the inferno, Michael ensured that the remnant sustaining his undead body was completely incinerated. This act freed his soul from the cycle of suffering and allowed him to find the peace he had been seeking since 1983. Unlike the restless spirits of his father and sister, Michael's journey was complete, and his sacrifice earned him a definitive rest. However, the question of what happens after Michael's death introduces one of the law's most persistent, highly debated theories: his connection to UCN. The UCN places the player character in a perpetual, customizable hellscape populated by vengeful animatronics. The widely accepted theory suggests that the player character in UCN is William Afton, who is trapped in the divine or spiritual judgment loop orchestrated by the vengeance of the crying child, as the spirit of Golden Freddy. Some theories, however, suggest that Michael Afton could also be the UCN protagonist, serving his own form of spiritual purgatory. This interpretation suggests that despite his final sacrifice, Michael's guilt over the bite of 83 was so immense that he remained trapped in a self-imposed spiritual prison. This theory is less supported by the final, forgiving tone of Henry's monologue, but it speaks to the depth of Michael's suffering. The more canonical view is that Michael found peace, but the very existence of UCN is a testament to the lingering power of the trauma he and his family created. Michael's legacy profoundly influences the later games, even if he is no longer physically present. His sacrifice made room for the next generation of threats, specifically the digital and corporate evils that emerge in the security breach timeline. The company, Fazbear Entertainment LLC, attempts to exploit the tragedy he finally put to rest, using his family's story as a source of propaganda and digital corruption. Michael's triumph was the final ethical human action against the overwhelming horror. He is remembered as the individual who took on the full burden of his family's evil and paid the ultimate price to secure the release of all the victims. His death marks the spiritual conclusion of the Afton family line. Part 22. Final Analysis: From Bully to Saviour. The journey of Michael Afton is the true central narrative thread of the entire Five Nights at Freddy's franchise, serving as a powerful and complex exploration of guilt, atonement, and redemption. His arc, spanning from the psychological abuse of the crying child in 1983 to his final self-immolating sacrifice in Pizzeria Simulator, provides the necessary human anchor for a story otherwise dominated by ghosts and robotic monsters. This complete transformation from a destructive bully into a selfless savior is the moral backbone of the series. Michael began as the undisputed villain of the domestic law. His cruelty, fueled by his own neglected resentment, led directly to the death of his younger brother in the bite of 83. This single act defined him as the perpetrator of the family's original sin, initiating his decades-long internal descent into guilt. His existence became a living hell, culminating in his physical transformation into the decaying undead figure after the events of Sister Location. This rebirth was the moment his penance became physically permanent. His path to redemption, though agonizing, was unwavering. It began with the desperate mission to find Elizabeth, a search that forced him to confront the overwhelming evil of his father, William Afton. Michael then dedicated his life to cleaning up the spiritual contamination created by his father, repeatedly facing death as he took on night guard jobs under aliases like Mike Schmidt. He hunted his father relentlessly, enduring the terror of Fazbear's fright, and ultimately collaborating with Henry Emily in the final lethal trap. Michael's final choice, to remain in the burning pizzeria, was the ultimate act of sacrifice. He willingly accepted his own death in the purifying fire, ensuring the destruction of the remnant that held him and the trapped spirits captive. This sacrifice was the only way to fully atone for the guilt of 1983 and to permanently neutralize the threat posed by his father. He died having undone the core tragedy he started as a child, finding his peace in the final flames. The legacy of Michael Afton is secured by this profound moral journey. He is the sympathetic protagonist, the one human figure who fought against the spiritual tide and won. His story provides hope within the relentless horror of the Afton curse, proving that even the most grievous sins can be repaid through selflessness and ultimate sacrifice. Michael Afton's life, filled with torment and death, became the necessary cost for the salvation of the children he was sworn to protect, cementing his place as the true, reluctant hero of Five Nights at Freddy's. His journey is a powerful testament to the idea that redemption must be earned through suffering.